In this next series of videos, I'm going to be presenting elements of a top-notch volunteer management plan. One of the resources that is unique to organizations in the nonprofit sector are volunteer hours. They're incredibly important and incredibly valuable for a number of reasons. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what we know about volunteers. So why bother? Why do we care so much about volunteer management? Well, there's at least a few reasons why. The first reason is that volunteering is often a first step to other important activities that nonprofits care a great deal about. For example, being a volunteer often leads to someone becoming an evangelist or ambassador for the nonprofit organizations, telling others about the great work the nonprofit does. And word of mouth is the coin of the realm when it comes to strategic communication. It is often the most trusted form of communication out there. Second, volunteers are much more likely to become donors. If you recall the time ask effect we talked about when it comes to nonprofit development, individuals who are asked first to volunteer end up donating more money than individuals who aren't asked to volunteer. And finally, there's a real value in volunteer time. The independent sector every year evaluates what the dollar value is that should be associated with a per hour volunteer. And we are really talking about around $25 an hour when it's all said and done. In addition, volunteers can perform some of the regular duties that staff members do. In fact, research studies looking at hospitals find that there's no difference in the outcomes between paid staff and volunteers doing some of that visiting and providing some basic needs for the families who come and visit in terms of outcomes. And finally, volunteer support is in some cases a criteria for grant applications. The number of volunteer hours shows community support, and it can be a key indicator for whether or not a nonprofit should receive a grant because of their standing in the community. So what do we mean by volunteers? There are three different types of volunteers, and I'm going to talk about really the last two types in the remainder of these presentations. But it's important to note that there are a class of volunteers called coerced volunteers. These are individuals who are being asked either because of a court mandate or because sometimes a school mandate that they perform a certain number of community service hours. The key question these volunteers usually ask is, who signs my form? That's different than volunteers who are there for reasons other than a mandate. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in most of our volunteer management plans. Spot volunteers are individuals who come to a volunteering event. They are there to volunteer on the spot as a one-time or sometimes a very occasional type of volunteering experience. Regular volunteers, in contrast, have a regular schedule of what they do as a volunteer. They have a job description. They are often performing tasks that paid staff would normally do if the nonprofit had the funds or had decided to use staff to perform that. For example, I'm a court-appointed special advocate for children. What that means is I'm a regular volunteer who works closely with a caseworker in order to ensure that a child in the foster care system who's been removed from their parents is able to have the basic needs that they need met. I advocate for the child. It's a regular role. I have regular hours. I have cases that are assigned to me. That's an example of a regular volunteer kind of job. What do we know about volunteers and why they serve? Well, volunteers certainly do volunteer because of the desire to serve a mission, and that's the most common thing that we think about. However, it's not the only reason that volunteers decide to give their time. Sometimes they're looking for positive relationships with other individuals. Volunteering is a great way to get to know others when you move into a new city. It is also sometimes they're looking for the work itself to be rewarding. So sometimes people who are looking for variety in the types of work that they perform find that in a volunteer job. Sometimes this is a way to learn new skills, to expand one's resume, and people are sometimes looking for that on their resumes and CVs, and so that provides an opportunity. And then particularly millennials are looking for the ability to see the social impact of their work. They want to know that what they're doing is making a difference and they can see that difference. And that's what's really rewarding about the volunteer activity. The barriers to volunteering are somewhat the opposite of some of the reasons why people volunteer, but not exclusively. The number one reason why people don't volunteer is the time commitment or schedule. That sometimes is a barrier to particular types of volunteer opportunities. People just say, I'm too busy. Also, sometimes people don't volunteer because they've had a bad experience. And those bad experiences are most often based in bad supervision of volunteers. They either lack a competent supervisor or they lack clearly defined responsibilities at the nonprofit organization. When I've placed students in nonprofits for service hours, these were the most common complaints that undergraduates relayed to me. They often had trouble finding their supervisor, or they were asked as soon as they walked in the door, what would you like to do here? The problem was, of course, that they hadn't been to the nonprofit before. They didn't know where the restroom was or didn't know the rules of the road. And so that was not really a clearly defined job and made them feel less valued. The other two reasons why people don't volunteer are the flip side of some of those reasons why they wanted to volunteer. So if they hope to form social ties and they don't, this can become a barrier to volunteerism. Or if they had hoped to see social impact of their work, but they ended up doing mostly back office jobs, this can also lead volunteers to give up on volunteering. So hopefully this video has helped you understand a little bit more about the why we care about volunteer management and a little bit more about the research on why people volunteer or don't.